Even the best of men can break their vows. Lust, greed, or any other sin can push an individual to go back on his or her word. But sometimes good intentions can be the cause, as was the case with Jon Snow. A bastard to the late Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Jon grew up in a home of nobility, yet he was out of place. Searching for higher purpose, he joined the Night's Watch, the protectors on the wall in the far north, and his black brothers became his new family. Like every other member of the Watch, Jon said his vows in view of gods and men, promising, amongst other things, to avoid the political conflicts south of the Wall. But when Lord Snow was elected Lord Commander of his order, every burden, every message, every piece of news fell on his shoulders, testing the limits of his willpower. When a letter from a fellow bastard arrived, disrespecting his former family by its very nature, Jon had a decision to make. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Exploring Fiction. Jon Snow, one of the most prominent characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, was undoubtedly a natural leader of the Night's Watch, but deep down he also desired to return to Winterfell and the Starks. Already, he'd grown to be somewhat unpopular as Lord Commander within the Watch for his policies regarding the Wildlings, but now his old family called for his aid. He'd uttered his vows with and for his black brothers, and wished not to lead with poor example, but the insolence and evil conducted by Ramsay Bolton toward Jon's original family was growing too blatant to bear. Two separate factions vied for his loyalties, tugging his heart back and forth within his chest. So, what decision did Jon Snow make, and what were its consequences? Did he make the correct decision? Let's explore. After the death of Lord Commander Jeor Mormont in a mutiny beyond the Wall, Jon Snow and the survivors all made their way back to Castle Black in due time, and through different avenues. The Wildling army was not far behind, and a great battle ensued. The Night's Watch was vastly outnumbered, and were only saved by the arrival of King Stannis Baratheon and his southern forces, who were driven north at the behest of the Red Priestess Melisandre. One conflict was resolved, that of the Wildlings, but another still loomed. This was the election of a new Lord Commander. Through diplomacy that would have made Littlefinger proud, Jon's best friend Samwell Tarly turned Lord Snow into Lord Commander Snow, much to Jon's disbelief. While his election to the highest position in the Night's Watch may have been controversial, Jon was popular amongst his brothers on the Wall and had displayed virtue, bravery, and leadership in their times of trouble. While to readers less familiar with the nuances and traditions of the characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, Jon's actions as Lord Commander were merely brave, the characters within the story may have viewed it differently. Assuredly, Jon was brave and did carry intentions of goodness in his heart. He welcomed the Wildlings after years of bitter rivalry, housed the king and his men, and sent many of his brothers to rebuild the failing strongholds across the Wall. However, to the more grizzled men of the Night's Watch, Jon Snow undoubtedly seemed like a young revolutionary with his head in the clouds, conjuring plans whose consequences he couldn't possibly comprehend. And as he set his grand schemes to work, he unknowingly removed all allies from his side. Sam and Maester Aemon were off for Oldtown, Gren and Pip to Eastwatch, and Dolorous Edd to Longbarrow. But before their departure, Jon had to kill the boy within him and become a man. The former captain of the Goldcloaks in King's Landing, the intolerable Janos Slynt, had defied Jon's orders to head the occupation of the abandoned castle Greyguard. Defying the Lord Commander was punishable by death, and remembering the ways of his father Lord Eddard, Jon beheaded Janos himself with the blade Longclaw. With this action, Jon Snow gained the respect of King Stannis and the admiration of his friends in the Watch, but for those who already despised him, only more hatred took root. These seeds of dissent would only become more impactful as Jon's friends within the Watch were slowly dispersed across the Wall and the world at large. Meanwhile, King Stannis Baratheon began his trek south. First, he heeded Jon Snow's advice to recruit the men of the northern mountain clans, and then stormed Deepwood Motte. Only more assured in the divinity of his quest by his victory there, he turned and made for the real prize of the north. Stannis and his army marched on Winterfell, where Ramsay Bolton and Arya Stark, who was actually Jane Poole, were set to be married. While the supposed prince that was promised trudged through the increasing snowstorms, Jon Snow carried out his most questionable act of all. Having seen firsthand the undead horrors beyond the wall, Lord Snow released his highly valued prisoner, the wildling woman Val, to treat with Tormund Giantsbane. The two free folk returned to Castle Black, where Tormund and Jon agreed on terms to let the wildlings settle on the safer side of the wall. Feeling disgruntled and betrayed, many of the brothers of the Night's Watch obeyed their Lord Commander grudgingly by helping the wildlings through. Jon could see he needed the wildlings' help defending the wall, and also felt the desire to keep them safe, for they were people of the realm as well. His black brothers, however, only saw their bitter enemies, who'd slaughtered their kin not so long ago. Nonetheless, they did and said nothing, disinclined to meet the same fate as Janos Slynt. Having received no word from the expedition led by Cotter Pike in retrieving the wildlings stranded at Hardhome, Jon made preparations to rescue the lot himself. But before he could depart, a letter with dire consequences for many important individuals in Westeros was delivered into his lap. Condescending and full of taunts, this manuscript was the infamous Pink Letter, addressed to Jon Snow from Ramsay Bolton. The letter described Ramsay's victory over Stannis, and Mance Rayder's failed attempt to save Arya Stark, Jane Poole, from the Boltons' clutches. Though the author, meaning, and even truth of the Pink Letter is still a mystery, its claims pushed Jon over the edge. He'd sat idly by as his father, Lord Eddard, was beheaded and defamed in King's Landing. He'd sat idly by as Sansa was virtually held captive by the Lannisters. He'd sat idly by as Bran and Rickon were supposedly murdered at the hands of Theon Turncloak. He'd even sat idly by as his half-brother Robb was killed in cold blood at the Red Wedding. But now, Ramsay Bolton dangled his defeat of Stannis and marriage to Arya Stark over Jon, mocking him blatantly. Finally, Jon couldn't sit idly by. Arya was his favorite sibling, for like Jon, she carried the physical and social characteristics of her father. Jon Snow and Arya Stark had formed a close bond in their days at Winterfell, possibly closer than any of the other Stark children. They often confided in each other before the rest of the family, and Jon even gifted Arya her most prized possession, the Sword Needle. And now, Ramsay, a member of the Bolton family who'd murdered Robb, had Arya in his clutches. It mattered little that who Jon thought was Arya Stark was actually Jane Poole, for the sentiments remained the same. At his wits' end, Jon threw reason and discipline to the wind. In the Shield Hall of Castle Black, Jon announced his resignation from the campaign to Hardhome and declared instead for Winterfell. Not going as far as to command his brothers of the Watch to accompany him, he merely asked for any aid they, or the Wildlings, would be willing to offer him. The Wildlings were roused to action by his call, but the members of the Night's Watch, especially those in tiers of higher command, stirred with discomfort. Their Lord Commander had openly stated he planned to break their vows, and while no black brother held perfectly to their promises, such an abrupt proclamation left them disturbed. What's more, he was now backed by the Wildlings, the former sworn enemies of the Night's Watch. A commotion arose out in the yard. Men, both Wildling and Crow, rushed to investigate with Jon Snow at their forefront, and found that the giant, Wun, had killed the Queen's man, Sir Patrick of King's Mountain. Though the two had been at odds since the Wildling passage under the wall, the chaotic scene only brought more distrust to Castle Black. In the din, mutiny was committed. Lord Steward Bowen Marsh, Wick Whittlestick, and other members of the Night's Watch stabbed Jon Snow numerous times. Tears ran down their faces, and they muttered the phrase, "For the Watch," as they turned on one of their own. But in their minds, it had to be done, for the vows of a black brother meant nothing if the Lord Commander himself disregarded them. While the pink letter and Ramsay's words within it troubled Jon Snow deeply, the stability of the Night's Watch may have been saved had the Lord Commander disregarded its words. Already through Jon's other actions and decrees, the Watch was put into a precarious position, but ignoring the letter from Winterfell would have assuredly had the opposite effect than not. Although Ramsay Bolton stated in the pink letter that he would march himself upon the Night's Watch now that he defeated Stannis, Jon could have waited at Castle Black for the Northmen to come to him. After all, he was surrounded by the men of the Night's Watch, who were his sworn brothers, and the Wildlings, individuals he rescued and aided when no one else would. Surely if Ramsay made for the wall with malicious intent, both groups would have stood with Jon against the Bolton forces. If Jon instead had chosen his new family, the Night's Watch, it would have meant abandoning his former half-sister Arya, but it also would have surely been a sounder decision for the realm in its entirety. Yet, sentiment for the Starks, with whom Jon had grown up, still burned in his belly. Ramsay held his dearest sibling captive and wed against her will at Jon's old home, an affront he couldn't dismiss. Had Jon not suffered a mutiny, he would have ridden south to Winterfell with an army of wildlings, and most likely some of the Black Brothers who fully supported him. Once there, he would meet Ramsay and the Bolton forces in a battle for Winterfell, for the North, and for Arya. It would make for a glorious battle, and an even more wonderful song, a crow leading wildlings to save his sister from torture. But back at Castle Black, the men of the Watch who declined to join him would have felt spurned indeed. Sure, Jon could have made the argument that since Ramsay threatened the Watch in the pink letter, that he was merely taking a preventative measure rather than a reactive one. However, how convinced his brothers would have been of this line of thinking was uncertain. Bowen Marsh and many others were already bitter about their new Lord Commander, for he'd broken his oaths, joining up with the Wildlings and sleeping with one of their women. That inclination would have assuredly been made worse as they stood at the gates of Castle Black, watching their leader at the head of a wildling force, breaking his vows quite openly this time. Whether Jon would have been able to defeat Ramsay and save Arya, or Jane Poole, at all is a complex question itself, but either way, by following the path leading to that scenario, meant he'd chosen his original family, the Starks. If he saved Arya and brought honor back to Winterfell, his old kin would ease in their suffering, but his brothers would fall into disarray, and the Night's Watch would be worse than when he left it. Though he was cut short by his zealous brothers on the wall, Jon Snow chose the latter situation, and with it, the Starks over the Night's Watch. Was it the right decision? It's almost impossible to say. Such complexity is what makes George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire so great. If Jon possessed a truly hardened heart like Roose Bolton, or even King Stannis to an extent, he could have fought away his feelings for Arya and continued his work on the wall, which was what certainly would have been best for the Night's Watch. Yet, in doing this, he would be condemning a sweet little girl, or at least that's how Jon thought of her, to an abhorrent fate as the wife to the devilish Ramsay Bolton. Similarly, by disregarding the pink letter, Jon would be allowing the conniving traitors to sully the name and image of House Stark. But if the heart of Jon Snow still contained empathy, and he went to rescue the girl, he would be hastening a collapse into anarchy of the Night's Watch, at a time when their strength was needed more than ever. So, the question of what a life is worth once again comes into play. Would it be better for Jon Snow to sacrifice the life of one child, who was like a sister to him, for the greater good of the realm? Or would it be better to have empathy, and take up arms to save the child, though it may bring instability to the Night's Watch and Westeros as a whole? Defying tradition is no easy thing, but Jon Snow chose to do so, picking a side in the politics of the realm by making to save his sister. Only by those of his black brothers who disagreed with his final decree was he harried in his quest, and it may even have brought his end. According to one's views, the mutiny at Castle Black showed that Jon Snow had either a good heart or a weak one. His choice was nigh impossible, for he had connections to two families that he dearly loved. Most of the other members of the Watch could hardly even relate, as they came from low-born homes or were orphans in the streets. But Jon Snow was the bastard of Winterfell. When the pink letter arrived in his hands, he was forced to choose between his two families. He could either pick the Night's Watch and fully abandon his old family, or pick the Starks and further distance himself from his new one. Jon chose the Starks and paid dearly for it. What will happen to the Night's Watch, the Wildlings, the Boltons, and Jane Poole is yet to be determined, but Jon's actions surely created quite the mess. His decision was his alone to bear, though, and he did so with honor. So, that's all for this video. Leave a comment below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you're new here. I'd love to have you. Check out my website, russellawellsauthor.com, for exclusive fiction and more, and subscribe to my mailing list for free exclusive content. The links for both are in the description below. So, like always, I will see you next time.